Hello. As you're working on your character analysis paper, I hope that you're using correct MLA format. I just wanted to go over this real quick, just in case you need to make some changes before you submit your paper. Um, you submit, you format your quote in a certain way when you're using MLA. And so this PowerPoint that I provided on the bottom of week 4 will help you with that. Hopefully you've looked at it already, but if not, here is a correctly formatted sentence example. As a recent article from Harvard Health Medical School reports, cases of severe lung disease among people who vape raise important questions about the safety of vaping. Okay, what do we notice about this sentence? First, it's just not a quote that's just thrown in there by itself. We introduce the quote. You should introduce your quote as well and say, as written by the author, blah, 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 to prove your point or something. And then put your quote. You've got to start it out with a introduction and then put a comma, and then you're going to use your quotation in that sentence after that. You have to put the word for word quote in quotation marks to show that you're copying it word for word. And then if you look at the very end, this is how you cite it. This is the author's last name and the page number that this quote was found on. We put them at the very end of the sentence in parentheses, and we put the period for the entire sentence after the quotation, after the citation. You don't put a period after this quote and then another one after the citation. There's only one period in the whole sentence, and it goes at the very end after the citation. So don't forget that. If you have several periods in your quote, you're going to lose some points. So let's look. This is the basic formula for introducing a quote into your paper. You have a signal phrase, and then you put a comma after it. And then you're going to use your quote from the book, word for word, in quotation marks. And then you're going to use an in-text citation at the very end in parentheses, and you're going to provide the period for the entire sentence at the end of the parentheses, at the end of your in-text citation. Okay, every quote, which there's 4 quotes required for this paper. Every quote has to have an in-text citation at the end to be proper. So you've got to show where those quotes came from. So why do we use signal phrases, because they help the readers identify the source and what type of information you're providing. Otherwise, it's called a floating quotation if you don't have a signal phrase, and you lose points on that. So you've got to introduce your quote with a signal phrase, and then you put a comma after it. So let's take a look at this. Evidence-based terms. So you're going to be providing evidence from your source, your story, to prove whatever point. If you're saying that somebody is prideful, then you're going to provide a quote that explains, that shows that they're prideful. And to do that, you need to use for instance, and then you can provide a quote. For instance, the character displays pride, and you can use the quote then to explain the pridefulness. Or you can say the author mentions, for instance, as the author points out. You need to use these in the beginning of your sentence that you have those quotes in, so that they're not floating quotes. You've got to explain that they are your quote and that they're your example of whatever it is you're trying to prove in that paragraph. So let's look at the next slide. These are all strong verbs that you probably should provide as well. If you'll notice, you are using present tense in your verbs. So like when you're writing your paper, you should not say anything is in past tense. The author wrote. No, you're going to say the author writes. So you need to check your verbs in your paper throughout the paper and make sure that there are S's on the end of that, because he's doing it. We're pretending like he's doing it right now, and we're talking about it in present tense. Even though they might have wrote it like 500 years ago, we're still going to use present tense in this paper when we talk about it. So make sure you go in and you make sure you don't have any EDs on the end of your your verbs showing that it was in the past tense. You want to make everything present tense about the writing, about the author. All right, credibility, just make sure that you have good sources, which this paper only requires one source, and it's the short story that you provided. So this is really not as valuable of information because you're only using your short story. But if you were, like later we're going to do a research paper, and you can't use like Wikipedia as a credible source for your paper because it's not credible all the time. So that's when that plays in effect. Your research paper, you're going to have to use like off of databases at the library, and you need to make sure they're credible. We're not going to use people's blogs or Pinterest or Wikipedia or any of those things. All right, let's go to the next one. Here are signal phrase examples, and you see we don't start the sentence off with a quote. The sentence never starts with a quote. It's introduced with a signal phrase, and then you throw your quotation in there, your quotes in there. So keep that in mind. You don't always need a comma. This is telling you if the sentence makes sense. A lot of times you need a comma before the quote, but in these instances you do not. If you use the word that, you don't have to put a quote in there. I mean a comma in there, sorry. So make sure you look over this to make sure that you're doing that correctly as well. This is an example. For example, Dr. Baroza, the lead dermatologist for the Kaplan Medical Group, warns sunscreen wears off, so children should reapply every 2 hours of exposure. So as you can see, we've started with a signal phrase here. It's for example, we put a comma because you need a comma after your signal phrase. And then you go on with your quote, and you can say who said it. You could say the author in this. You're not going to say doctor because we're not using any sources but our author. So make sure that yours is formatted this way. Look at this at the very end. We do not have a period in this quote. We have a period after the citation at the end of the sentence. Let's say, which your book should have a page number, but and so you should always have your last name and the page number. Once you use the last name in the first quote, you only have to put the page number in the 3 other quotes because we only have one source this time. But in other papers, like the research paper, you're going to have more sources, and then you would have to provide the author's last name for all of the quotes. But since we only have one source for this paper, you only need to provide the author's last name in one quote and the page number, and then the rest of them can just be the page number in parentheses. And look, the period always, always, always goes at the very end of the sentence. So hopefully this is going to help you. Remember, a signal phrase, comma, then your quote in quotation marks. If you're copying it word for word, you have to use quotation marks, and then your in-text citations in parentheses, the last author's last name, page number, or if it's the second, third, or fourth quote that you're using in your paper, just the page number is fine. And then you're going to close your parentheses, and then you're going to put your period after that. The only sentence period goes at the very, very end. So hopefully you are doing well on your paper and things are going great. I look forward to reading them, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great day.